during the presentations, then they can, of course, always put them in the chat, and I can flag them up then to the speakers as well. So our third speaker is Emma Sabzalieva. I see she's here. Excellent, in the chat. She is joining us from UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. And her talk is titled Internationalization for All Towards a Sustainable Future for Academic Mobility.
Well, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks very much for the invitation to join this exciting and very diverse online international conference. If you'll give me just a second to put my slides up, and then I will begin. Just a moment. And of course, I have so many windows open, I can't find it. I'm going to just do it again. There we are. Excellent. Would somebody be kind enough just to let me know that you can see the slides and hear me okay? Yep, excellent, very good. All right, so I'm going to be talking today about higher education from the perspective of higher education internationalization, but also about academic mobility, and thinking about how we might be able to move towards a sustainable future for academic mobility. So as mentioned, I'm Emma Sabzalieva. I'm Head of Research and Foresight for UNESCO's International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. So today, in the time I have available, I just want to give a very brief overview about what UNESCO does when it comes to higher education internationalization. I'll then take stock and we can think together about where we are now at the current moment with internationalization. And in the third part, we'll kind of go from the current to the future, and that will build on some work we did at our institute in recent months, which relates to the future of academic mobility. So first, a little bit about UNESCO's work and our institute. So I imagine that you're all familiar with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, also called Agenda 2030. So when we think about what higher education internationalization is, whether we think about it as processes, whether we think about it as activities, you can see some very direct links to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. The obvious link is to SDG 4 on quality education, and indeed there's actually an indicator within that measuring the number of students who get scholarships to study abroad, so even more specific, connecting to internationalization. But actually what we also see is that in those internationalization activities, many of the SDGs are taken up through the curriculum, through the kind of transnational learning. So this SDG is the current kind of agenda that United Nations and all of us at UNESCO and the other United Nations institutes are really focusing on. With UNESCO in particular, our kind of core mission since we were founded after the Second World War has been about peace building. So again, that has very direct links to education in general and to internationalization in higher education, because UNESCO thinks and believes that peace building is something that can be done through international cooperation, through knowledge sharing, and through the free flow of ideas. So all of those are things which, done well, internationalization of higher education should support. So in fact, you can see that reflected in some of the work that UNESCO has done over time. There are over 1,500 publications in UNESCO, that's the UNESCO Digital Library, which have the word internationalization. That's only in English, so of course we have 6 official languages at UNESCO. You'll be able to find more in other languages as well. More recently, this year, UNESCO convened the 3rd World Higher Education Conference, And that was organised along 10 thematic lines, and all of them again have connections with this international dimension of higher education, but two specifically did. One was a track on academic mobility, and the other was a track on international cooperation. So you can see that as this kind of sort of global convention was brought together in the World Higher Education Conference, that this matter of internationalization is really at the forefront of people's minds. Following that conference, which was held in May this year in Spain, there's been a follow-up process, and we have currently got an open consultation on the post-World Higher Education Conference roadmap. And that's something which, after the presentation, I can find a link to and put in the chat. So would very much encourage you, your institutions, and wherever you're located to get involved in that consultation process and help shape UNESCO's work in higher education in the years to come. And the other point I want to mention of relevance to internationalization is UNESCO's work on the global and regional conventions on the mutual recognition of qualifications. Now, we have some very fresh, hot off the press and exciting news, which is that the global convention has now been ratified by enough states. So starting from January 2023, it's going to come into force. This is very, very new news. You are among the first to hear about it. So you'll start to see a lot more activity in that regard. Then we have 5 regional conventions also dealing with how do we understand and share information about qualifications, how do we support students to be mobile across borders through this mutual recognition of qualifications and prior learning. And those are in various states. So in Asia and Pacific, the Tokyo Declaration came into force in 2015. In Africa, the Addis Ababa Convention came into force in 2019. And in our region of Latin America and Caribbean, our new regional convention came into force about a month ago. So you can see that they're in varying stages of development and work. And actually Asia Pacific is one of the regions where other parts of the world are looking to and learning from in terms of the collaboration and connections across states when it comes to this element of higher education internationalization. So that's a little bit about UNESCO in general. If you don't mind, I just say a few words about our institute. So it's IESALC, which is actually the Spanish language version of our name, which, as mentioned before, is International Institute for Higher Education in Latin America and the Caribbean. So of all of the United Nations system, of various offices and institutes, ours is the only specialized institute in that whole system that has a mission to contribute towards higher education improvement. So historically, we've been based and worked in Latin America and the Caribbean, but over the last few years, we've been asked by UNESCO to take on a more global mandate. So now a lot of our work is international, comparative, or it takes up, for example, some parts of Latin America and the Caribbean and other parts around the world. So currently we have 4 parts to our mission. We seek to promote the universal right to higher education. We seek to empower institutions and higher education systems to be more responsive, inclusive, relevant, and efficient. We seek to nurture innovation in higher education, and we seek to re-envision internationalization, so super relevant for today. And you can see that all of those 4 are kind of connected by the Sustainable Development Goals that I already mentioned about. So I'd be very happy to talk about some of the other work that we do at our institute. Today, though, I'm going to focus, as I've mentioned, on internationalization and academic mobility. So let's now move and think about where are we now when it comes to internationalization. So first, I think it's really important to say that demand for higher education continues to rise. So what you're seeing on your screen is a chart from the last 20 years that shows the level of global enrollment. So how many students are there in tertiary education all around the world? In 2000, there were 100 million. By 2010, that had gone up to 181 million. 2020, which is the year for which we have the most recent data, 236 million. So just in the last 10 years alone, participation has actually increased by 30% around the world. Now, because we're based out of Seoul today for this conference, I wanted to look as well into the data for the Republic of Korea. The participation picture is actually a little bit different. Those of you who are in that system probably know this very, very well, much better than I do. But the enrolment's actually been fairly stable over this 20-year period. In fact, since from 2000 to 2010, enrolment went up a little bit, and then it's actually gone down a little bit in the last decade. But overall, we see a relatively stable enrolment. And the reason for that stability, I think, is because participation is so high already to begin with in the Republic of Korea. Like, it's 100% when you look at the enrolment ratio. So almost all, if not all, high school leavers and people who are within, I think, a 4-year period of leaving high school, which is the kind of group of ages that UNESCO Institute for Statistics counts when it counts the tertiary enrolment ratio, go on to higher education. That's an astonishing high figure. Globally, this increase, though, is also very important because it tells us about the demand for higher education on that global scale. And what we see in terms of the enrolment ratio now is that has reached 40% around the world. Of course, that is not even. We have this incredibly high participation rate in the Republic of Korea. In Canada, where I'm joining you from today, we have participation of about 70%. But there are other regions and other countries where participation is much, much lower than 40%. So overall, we have a very strong picture of growth with some unevenness within the particular overall pattern. So then let's think about mobility. And, as a facet of internationalization, student mobility is a very important metric. It's one of the few that we actually count at international level. So here on the chart, you can see the number of internationally mobile students who are coming into Republic of Korea and going from the Republic of Korea. These are some really interesting patterns, again, tracking this over the last 20 years. So what you see for the first 10 years from 2000 to 2010 is a similar kind of pattern of growth, although the starting point for students coming into, so this is international students coming to Korea, much, much lower at the beginning, but kind of growing at the same rate as Korean students are leaving to go and study abroad. However, a very interesting, I think, new dynamic over the last couple of years is that the number of students coming into Korea to study has overtaken the number who are going out to study. And usually when you look at kind of on a country by country basis, you don't see that kind of, this sort of quite big shift in the way that these patterns work. And what that shows you then is this huge increase in the number of international students coming to Korea. You can see in the data on the left that number has grown by well over 3,000% in the last 20 years, which is a huge, huge number. Outbound mobility has also increased, but at a relatively modest 45%. But, of course, that's still a very high increase over time. So you can see that you have about 100,000 Koreans going abroad to study every year as at 2020. However, because there is such an enormous universal participation rate in higher education in Korea, the total proportion of those students going outbound to study, going international to study, is just about 3%. Now, if we had more time, I would sort of stop and quiz you guys a little bit to see how you feel that matches against global patterns. But for now, I will reveal already that actually that proportion, while it may seem very low, is the same proportion as we see in global terms. So on average, although the number of international students around the world has been increasing in recent years, same as the patterns that we see here in Korea, although playing out slightly differently. In fact, when you look at the total number of students who are internationally mobile compared to the total number of students who are studying in tertiary education, only about 3% are mobile, same number as we see in Korea. I'm going to come back to that because I think that's a really important figure to take into account because it's so low. So then, again, we can look at mobility in a different way and see where do students go from? Where do students go from and to? So this graph here on the left of my screen, hopefully on the left of yours, looks at the outbound students by host region. So what you can see, and I'm not sure whether my cursor is showing, but the lighter blue kind of ring, which makes up just over half of the total, is the region of North America and Western Europe. So just over half of all internationally mobile students go to a country in North America or Western Europe to study. Much, much bigger proportion than any of the other world regions. These world regions, by the way, are UNESCO's way of cutting up the world into different regions. And each has its own list of countries underneath it. The second most, I suppose we could say, popular region is East Asia and the Pacific. So again, think about the number of inbound students coming to Korea really growing, and you can start to understand why we have this region in which Korea would be considered coming here, with 16% of outbound students. Then Central and Eastern Europe taking up 15%. That might seem surprising because when you think about what are the sort of traditional or the popular destinations for international students, you might not think about Central and Eastern Europe. That's primarily explained by Russia, which is a massive host of international students, primarily from the ex-Soviet region. Then if you look at the rest of the world basically takes up very few of international students. That's the Arab states, that's Latin America and the Caribbean, Central Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, South and West Asia. So how does that compare with where Korean students go to study? Yes, before I show you that, I think, again, I've made the point that over half of the students who go abroad go to North America and Western Europe. And if you think about flows within that segment, actually what we see is that most students go from the global south to the global north. So again, if you're thinking about equity and equality when it comes to internationalization, that's a very important point of inequality. So now if we kind of compare those figures with where Korean students are going, you have not quite the same pattern, but again, two very clear leading regions. So if in global perspective, about half of students go to North America and Western Europe, from Korea, that number is 70%. Then almost all of the rest stay within the region. So it's interregionally. So you have 26.5% who are mobile within the region of East Asia and the Pacific. The other regions between them make up less than 5% of the total. You can see that they're marked here. So I think, again, it's always interesting to look at these kind of different mobility dynamics by country, by global perspective, and to think about what that tells us about why international students choose certain destinations, how knowledge is flowing around the world, if we think about international students about taking knowledge, and how we understand what academic mobility is. Now, this third point, I think, becomes very important when we get to the pandemic and when people are no longer able to be physically mobile, because that is what this is measuring. This is measuring physical mobility, so people packing their suitcases and crossing the borders to go and study for a period of time. So I've mentioned the overall increase in the number of international students. So we had 6 million in 2020. We don't yet have good data for 2021 or 2022, this current year. However, despite or even because of the pandemic, we have at least one prediction that I've seen, and I've looked at lots of different ones, to suggest that that number is going to go up to 8 million by 2025. So this demand for higher education that we saw in general also feeds into an increasing demand for international education and for internationalization. So then, as I mentioned, we have the pandemic. So when we don't have the opportunity to travel, when a lot of our institutions are closed or transitioned to online, what have been the main impacts? And here I'm drawing on some work we did at our institute and published earlier this year, where we reviewed a number of other global and regional studies on the impact of the pandemic. So we found that 220 million tertiary students worldwide were affected by COVID-19. If you remember back to the enrollment figure that I showed, which is 236 million, I think it's fair to say that, you know, give or take, every single tertiary education student was affected in some way by COVID-19, every single student. We have a study that's shown that 73% of European universities reported disruptions to academic mobility. There have been other studies, of course, in other regions showing similar figures. Another study found that 58% of global researchers experienced delays to their project, and 67% of higher education institutions or HEIs have moved to online teaching by May 2020. So here in Canada, for example, we started to feel the impact of the pandemic in March 2020. So if you can imagine, from March to May, in that 2-month period, almost well over 2/3 of higher education institutions have switched to online. For me, that's an astonishing transition, especially because the dominant model of higher education up until then, with many exceptions of course, dominant model have been in-person instruction. And as I mentioned, when we think about the impact for internationalization and for students, that's typically understood as physical mobility, right? In-person, physical, that's our kind of model and our understanding of higher education up until now. So what might happen next? So we're going to start to think in that direction. So the European Association for International Education put out this very interesting kind of 3 possible futures for academic mobility in light of the pandemic, which, as at June 2021 and even now in December 2022 is certainly not, has not finished with us. But their predictions were that there might be, if we go negatively, very minimal rebound to student numbers, so that kind of estimate figure of 8 million definitely wouldn't reach it. We might get back to 6 million, but we might not. So student mobility would remain low in a post-pandemic environment. They also think that students might stay more within their own region. That's certainly a trend we're seeing in Asia. Another scenario is that there would be a rebound in the numbers of internationally mobile students, but perhaps little growth. So that 6 million wouldn't get to 8 million in 2025. It might get to just a little bit more than 6 million. And of course, then you can already imagine, I think, that the third scenario is one of strong growth, where student mobility rebounds to pre-pandemic levels and it markedly increases. So it might get to 8 million, it could even get to 9 million or 10 million students who are internationally mobile. So I think this is interesting because it helps us, it gives us a kind of structure for thinking about how the future might unfold in terms of academic mobility. But again, what it assumes is a basis where mobility is something that we do in person, right? So higher education is a predominantly in-person experience, whether you're staying at your own institution or studying abroad. So that's one of the perhaps criticisms I would have of this modelling. So with that in mind, I want to move to the final part of the presentation to help think about how we might move towards a sustainable future for academic mobility. So here I'm going to draw on a report that we published earlier this year. You can see a copy of the cover. On the right, the report is called Moving Minds: Opportunities and Challenges for Virtual Student Mobility in a Post-Pandemic World. So what we wanted to do with that is understand this idea about virtual student mobility in global perspective, understand what the opportunities and challenges are when it's implemented, and also provide recommendations about embedding virtual modalities of student mobility. The recommendations we provide across multiple levels. So for governments, for institutions, for faculty members, for IT technicians and other support staff, and of course for students as well. So here, when we talk about virtual student mobility, what we're talking about is a technology-based or enabled form of mobility. So rather than students having to physically cross borders, this is a form of mobility that they can do without actually having to do that, but the mobility happens thanks to the support of technology. Sometimes you would hear others talk about virtual exchange. You might hear people talk about the acronym COIL, which is Collaborative Online International Learning. For various reasons, we chose to take up the terminology that we feel is rather broader, called virtual student mobility. So that's how I'm going to talk about it. We also refer to it as VSM by the acronym. Those were the objectives of the study. And the study we did in really in as global a perspective as we could. And by the way, we did this during the pandemic. We undertook the study in 2020 and 2021. So we did the whole thing desk-based. Unfortunately for us, we didn't get to take field trips to all of these many locations. So in total in the report, we have 14 case studies. 10 of those are case studies of university or higher education institution partnerships. That's the map on the top left. So you can see from that that many of those were bilateral, so between 2 institutions. Some of them were multilateral. There's a very nice one that you can see crossing from the west of the map on the picture to the east. And we had 4 university alliances. That's shown on the map on the bottom right of your screen. So we had the ASEAN University Network, we had the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, we had CIVIS, which is a European alliance, and the Hemispheric University Consortium, which takes in the Americas. So altogether, across those 14 case studies, we had 73 higher education institutions across 38 countries, which we thought was not a bad sample for an initial study like this. And I should say as well that there's very little work that's been done to try and measure and map the quantity of virtual mobility that's happening, whether before the pandemic or as a result of the pandemic. So what we found is that in this case, the pandemic has been a driver of innovation when it comes to mobility. Now, this in no way is us saying that the pandemic has somehow been a good thing. Absolutely not. But because of the circumstances, what we've seen is many institutions have used this as a way to overcome travel restrictions and to build on previous partnerships. So these are some of the kind of success factors, if you like, that we found across our study. So as I mentioned, this is a way to overcome travel restrictions, to continue offering students some kind of continuity in their experience. We found that having an institutional champion, that means somebody, whether they're in the faculty or in the international office or somewhere else, who was really committed to pushing this forward, really helped in the cases that we looked at. We found that most of the universities and institutions that we had as case studies had worked together on something before. Now, sometimes it had been on mobility, but mostly it hadn't been on a virtual student mobility. So that establishment of a partnership was very important in kind of moving that relationship to the next step. The willingness to experiment was very important. We don't know, as I mentioned, the figures on how much virtual mobility was happening before the pandemic, but I can tell you it was probably fairly insignificant compared to the amount of physical mobility. So for many, this was the first time they were doing it. So having that openness, that willingness, sometimes that experimental willingness came from the Vice Chancellor or the university leadership. Sometimes it came from the faculty who were putting it together. Sometimes it came from the students themselves. We saw that virtual mobility can account for a mix of learning activities, and it has a wide subject application. One of the critiques of virtual mobility is people say, well, how could you do a lab-based subject through a computer? Actually, if you look at the types of subjects that we have as case studies, we specifically chose from different subject areas to show the fact that it can be done. Whether you're doing, we had maternal health, we had entrepreneurship, all the other subjects are kind of leaving me now, but believe me, they were really, really very wide, and the activities were also wide-ranging as well. The other thing that we did as part of the study was survey the students at the case study institutions to find out what they had made of their experiences. And you have to remember we had about 100 students complete the survey, and very positively 74% said they would do virtual student mobility again if they had the chance. Just over half were satisfied or very satisfied with the experience, and 62% said they'd be likely or very likely to recommend it to others. So bear in mind that none of these students in the survey had done any kind of virtual mobility before. We think these are really positive statistics that we can and improve places that we can build from. So we asked students what the best part of their experience was in the virtual student mobility. Here I'm showing you the top 3 responses: flexibility in planning the workload, more convenient to stay at home, and cheaper than travelling abroad. So we did a little bit of work on the demographics of the students who completed the survey, and I think even without breaking that down by the demographics, you can see from these top 3 choices that they made, the virtual student mobility has the possibility to expand access to international student mobility, to internationalization. So specifically in this survey, to people who are carers, whether for children, parents, somebody else, students who study part-time, students who are working. However, what you can see here with the red box is that even though the students were relatively positive about their experience, about half of them said that in the future they'd prefer physical mobility. So that says to us perhaps that virtual mobility doesn't yet have the same level of prestige, and not only prestige but understanding. It may simply be the case that because it's still so new for so many students, they don't really know about it, and perhaps it's not something they had considered. And I think going forward you have some incredible opportunities that virtual mobility can create for access to internationalization. At the same time, we need to be careful not to make some kind of hierarchy where physical mobility is the gold standard and virtual mobility is kind of for the students that can't afford to study abroad. That is absolutely not the way that we think things should move forward. I think I'm probably working pretty fast through the time that I have available. So let me just say in brief that the key takeaway from this slide is that virtual student mobility is also a lot cheaper. It's cheaper for institutions to operate, it's cheaper for students, as we know, but it isn't free. I think that's very important, particularly when you're starting up a virtual student mobility program. Things like paying somebody to create materials or for faculty time, perhaps there's even software costs for students. Those are some of the extra costs. There is external funding that's sometimes available. In our cases, for example, we had one partnership that had funding from the Association of Commonwealth Universities, another had funding from a US foundation called the Stevens Initiative. But I think that's a very important thing, because people say, oh yes, you know, like this is going to solve my university's financial problems. It may help to a small extent, but there are still costs involved, particularly at the startup point. The main problem for all of the participants was the internet and connectivity. So when we asked students what was the most challenging part of their virtual student mobility experience, you can see very clearly that problems with the internet connection was the main issue. And that, I think, gets us to thinking about this so-called digital divide, which exists both between countries, but also within countries as well. Time zone differences was another bugbear for some of the students. And then interestingly, the third and the fourth point, which you can see on the chart here, relate to the quality of the provision. So students said that getting timely or quality feedback was problematic, and some said that teaching or supervision was lower quality than it was in person. So I think, you know, going forward, if we want virtual forms of mobility to help support more sustainability and internationalization, this quality issue really needs to be taken up. So this is my last slide, just trying to bring together some of the key points where we see, from our institute's perspective, a future where international cooperation will be enhanced by technology, and that includes internationalization as well. So we saw that the pandemic opened opportunities for virtual cooperation. A reminder again, the cost is minimal, but it exists. There's also a cost, not in financial terms, but in resource terms for faculty and for staff, especially during the setup. A very important point to make is that intercultural exchange is, according to respondents in our case studies, entirely possible online. That's another, I think, common myth about virtual mobility, that, you know, if you're not there, if you can't, let's say, smell the local food, if you can't, you know, go walking and get lost in the local city, those kind of things that contribute to the kind of intangible benefits of internationalization. It's different, of course, when it's mediated online, but it's possible. And I think, again, that's something very important to take away. The point that I made before about access, again, I resonate here that we think that virtual student mobility is more inclusive for various reasons than in-person exchanges. And we see this as a way to really harness technology to make it work for us, to make it work for our common good. So I will leave you that thought. Thank you very much. Gamsahamnida. It's been a pleasure to have the opportunity to share with you today, and I'm looking forward to your questions, to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emma. I think if it's okay, in the interests of time, we may move on to the next speaker, but hopefully we can come back. I hope that we will come back to this in the discussion at the end, because, I mean, as I say, you brought up so many important points. So shall we, for now, move directly on to Phoebe Kang of the University of Toronto, who will address us on the topic. Oh, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, I wasn't sure if Emma will be able to come back for discussion, so I wanted to see if we could allocate a few minutes for Q&A for Emma.
Yeah, absolutely. We're within our wiggle room, so yeah, for sure.
If it's okay, I actually have a quick question, Emma, if you don't mind. I'm
That'd be my
always
pleasure.
fascinated by Emma's presentations, and I just wanted to ask, one of the goals of UNESCO in higher education was to promote the universal right to higher education. And, at least, in case of Canada, the costs are going up for international students, and same for the domestic students. And I just wondered, aside from the financial, factors, how does UNESCO see that could be achievable?
Yeah, I think that, thank you. It's a really good and important question, and it's one which I think there needs to be, as you mentioned, the finances are of course like the key thing, but there are lots of other ways that governments can work towards the right to higher education. So I think from UNESCO's perspective, as an international organization, there's certain roles and responsibilities we can take on. One of the most important things that we can do, I think, is advocacy in that area. So for example, at my institute, I coordinate our work on the right to higher education. This year we've had a major series of consultations. We've done regional consultations in all world regions. We've done thematic consultations. In fact, I've got another thematic consultation on gender and the right to higher education coming up in early next year. We've commissioned a series of national case studies which are looking at countries specifically that have introduced policies on the right to higher education, whether that's like access to higher education, or it could be related to student success, or even to post-study trajectories, whether to the labour market or simply in terms of how graduates relate to their societies. So I think that advocacy role means that we're not only kind of raising attention and awareness to what we see as this important issue, which is part of our human rights. We have the right to education, and higher education as part of the educational spectrum is part of that, but it's not something where there's been so much attention to. So we can also create knowledge, and in this case it's sort of, I wouldn't necessarily say best practice sharing, but it's kind of sharing information about where the right to higher education has been accented in different places. That information we hope will be important for policymakers, but also others as well. And so it can kind of work on different levels beyond resources. I think a lot of it at the national level is about political will. That doesn't cost any money, but it's really very difficult. And in fact, it costs sometimes more than just money, if I can make that analogy. The other, and so then we can think about different actors who are within the higher education system. As an example, we've recently started a series of dialogues with youth in Latin America to ask them, what do you know about the right to higher education? What are the most important aspects of the right to higher education for you? And how can we, as UNESCO, help you advocate for your right to higher education? So I think, again, there's different strategies that we can take up for different kinds of stakeholders. And a lot of funding would obviously help as well.
Any other quick questions? Okay, fantastic. In that case then, Phoebe,